Alright, so this video is gonna be, maybe feature Frank, my cat, who's probably gonna walk across the camera at some point. But this video is gonna be about Aristophanes' play Clouds. If I'm honest, I'm not a huge fan of Clouds, in part because it's very much an anti-sophist satire, and I tend to be kind of a fan of the sophists. So the sophists were a loose collection of educated people from all over the ancient Greek-speaking world, starting in about the late 6th century, early 5th century, and essentially what they did was they accumulated a bunch of knowledge, particularly about rhetoric, and then they came to cities like Athens that were democratic, or that had some sort of democratic process, and they would teach rhetoric. They would teach what we would now call the liberal arts, so things like geometry, music, astronomy, etc., etc. And they got paid for this. So they were really the first professors. And as a professor myself, I do tend to identify with the sophists. Further, the sophists so at least from the sense that we have from fragments of texts from sophists themselves, but more significantly from people like Plato and his sort of recordings or his representations of what Socrates said, we get a sense that sophistic philosophy or sophistic rhetoric was not concerned with the question of truth. It was concerned with the question of persuasion. So that's really central to Clouds, is this idea that it doesn't matter whether the argument that you're making is just or unjust, whether it's right or wrong. What matters is whether you can use logic, you can use language, you can use trickery to achieve your own ends. So the play is about this father and son. So we have Strepsiades, who is the father, and he is deeply in debt because his son, Philip, he's a lover of horses, and that seems to involve both purchasing horses and horse-related stuff, and also gambling on horse races. So Philippides has run up a massive amount of debt on Strepsiades' account. So Strepsiades is primarily concerned with figuring out ways to not pay his debts. And he hits on the idea of going to Socrates' think school. And this is actually a really interesting sort of thing, because Socrates, as far as we know, was virulently opposed to the sophists, and yet in Aristophanes, Socrates is the sort of king of the sophists. He's the king of these philosophers who argue that wrong is right and right is wrong, and this sort of stuff. So we get this notion throughout the play that what the sophists do, what Socrates does, and what they train people to do, is to make wrong arguments stronger. So we get I mean, we get this in a number of subtle ways, but we also get it in some more overt ways. Partway through the play, we actually have a sort of allegorical component where right logic and wrong logic come out and have a lengthy debate over which course of education Strepsiades should adopt. Because initially Strepsiades comes to Socrates himself and and asks Socrates to teach him to use rhetoric to get out of his debts. And when it turns out that Strepsiades kind of isn't clever enough to retain the material, he then does later come back and force Philippides to go to this school. But we have this lengthy debate between right logic and wrong logic that largely centers on the question of whose approach to education is better and why. So right logic, this is Aristophanes' sort of conservatism coming to the forefront. Right logic is arguing for a very traditional Greek style of education. So a lot of physical activity, renunciation of enjoyment, renunciation of worldly pleasures, nice food, going and having hot baths, sex with women, or sex with men as well. So all these sort of things, like rigorously applying yourself in this very sort of old school, uphill both ways, barefoot in the snow type education system. And what right logic argues is that the benefit of this is that it generates virtue. Wrong logic comes along and basically says, yeah, none of those things that you've said, discipline, self-control, physical strength, etc., are really virtues. Actually, those are all follies. Those are all failures to really enjoy life. And so what you should do is follow my path of trickery, deceit, deception, hedonism, etc., because you'll have greater enjoyment of life and you'll experience things without consequences. So that's fundamentally what Strepsiades wants, is to get out from paying his debts. He wants to have the benefits of Philippides' having spent all this money without Strepsiades actually having to be on the hook for it. What ends up happening is that Strepsiades is too dumb to handle the material, and so he has to go and basically force Philippides to come to this school. And Philippides does, and he learns what Socrates and the Sophists are teaching, which turns out not to be a great thing for Strepsiades. So Strepsiades' plan was for his son to go and learn all this material and then argue in court cases that actually he wasn't responsible for any of these debts. Instead, something else happens, and the chorus tells us about this. The chorus, which is a chorus of clouds, who are deities. Actually, I'll detour back just a little bit because I want to give you this introduction to what the chorus of clouds is about. So, somewhat early in the play, Socrates says, "Did you never know or imagine they were goddesses?" And Strepsiades says, "Not I, so help me. I had a notion they were fog and smoke." At which point Socrates says, "Look you, man, These are the nursing mothers of sophists, fakers, quacks, bejeweled long hairs, bards bombastical, chorus projectors and star interpreters. These idlers they support for flattering them in oracular mouthings. So the clouds are the deities of the sophists because they're ephemeral, because they're unreliable, because they're changeable. And this, in the play, are the sort of key virtues of the sophists and of wrong logic. Now, what ends up happening is that the tables are turned on Strepsiades because Philippides has learned not to respect old values, like honoring your father and mother, and he's learned to take apart other people's arguments, like why you should honor your father and mother. So the chorus says, "Beware of a passion deceits to weave, the old man craves to deny his debt. The requital he'll this day receive will teach him a lesson he'll never forget. 'Twas he that began the plot to deceive, he'll be caught in the tangle of his own net. What he long wanted now he's got, his son is expert in gainsaying. He can twiddle justice, he can plot, every decency betraying, saying what isn't is and what is not. For a son deaf mute he'll soon be praying." So, at the end of the play, Philippides beats Strepsiades and then makes an argument that compels Strepsiades to accept that he should have been beaten. So the tables are turned, and what Strepsiades learns in this very sort of, again, conservative Aristophanes, Aristophanic ending is that actually you should have stuck with the old ways, you should have stuck with right logic, you should have been thrifty and honest and whatever virtues it is. So we get all of that at the end. The other bit that I want to talk about in Clouds is, again, this very sort of typical Aristophanes gesture, this meta-theatrical gesture. He's got a couple of small meta-theatrical gestures, but he's also got this one lengthy bit of a type that he really likes, that we see in plays like Acharnians and Knights. I think in Acharnians as well. We've got this lengthy digression where the chorus just sort of talks about how awesome Aristophanes is as a poet and why the judges should award him the prize. And actually, he directly critiques the audience for not having given him the prize for a previous version of this play. He says, or the chorus says, sorry, "Dear spectators, freely shall I speak to you, yes and truly, so help me Dionysus, whose ward I am. So surely may I win, so surely be deemed a poet, as I reckon you a clever audience, and this the best of my plays. Much labor has it cost me, and I thought you'd approve it, but I retired defeated most unfairly by clumsy rivals." And then he goes through this list of references to other plays, bad plays in his opinion, references to other poets who have, other comic poets specifically, who've used what he thinks of as cheap devices, who have stolen material or sort of used the same gags over and over in their plays. And he ends this digression by saying, "But in my inventions, if you find delight, your reputation for cleverness will forever abide." So basically, in Knights we get a similar sort of thing as this idea that if you award me the prize as the best comic poet, everybody will believe that you are a smart audience. And this is Aristophanes right down to the ground.